It's easy to believe that meaningful change requires dramatic effort, long hours, and constant intensity. Most people assume that unless they completely overhaul their routines, nothing truly shifts. But there's a quieter, more sustainable idea at play here, one that feels almost too simple at first glance. The idea is that just one focused hour a day, used with intention, can gradually reshape your entire life. Not overnight, not in bursts of motivation, but through steady, deliberate attention. Think about how most days actually unfold. Hours slip away in small, unnoticed ways, scrolling, reacting, handling urgent but unimportant tasks. By the end of the day, there's often a sense of having been busy without moving forward in any meaningful direction. The promise of a single dedicated hour challenges that pattern. It suggests that progress doesn't come from doing more things, but from doing the right thing consistently. This 1 hour is not meant to be squeezed in carelessly. It's not the leftover time when you're already tired or distracted. It's intentional time, protected and treated as valuable. In a way, it becomes a quiet agreement with yourself, a daily investment in the person you're trying to become. And what makes it powerful is not intensity, but consistency. When you show up every day, even imperfectly, something begins to compound. At first, the changes are almost invisible. 1 hour of reading, writing, practicing a skill, or building something doesn't feel like much. It's easy to doubt whether it's enough. But over weeks and months, the accumulation starts to reveal itself. Knowledge deepens, skills sharpen, confidence grows, not because of sudden breakthroughs, but because of repeated exposure and effort. There's also a psychological shift that happens when you commit to a fixed, manageable amount of time. Large goals often create resistance. They feel heavy, distant, and overwhelming. But an hour feels doable. It lowers the barrier to starting, which is often the hardest part. Once you begin, momentum takes over. And interestingly, the discipline of stopping after an hour can be just as important as starting. It prevents burnout and keeps the process sustainable. Another subtle advantage is clarity. When you know you only have 1 hour, you naturally become more selective. You begin to ask better questions. What actually matters today? What will move me forward? This constraint filters out distractions. It forces you to focus on what truly counts rather than spreading your energy thin across too many directions. There's also a deeper lesson hidden in this approach. It challenges the belief that success belongs only to those with unlimited time or extraordinary talent. Instead, it places the emphasis on daily choices. Anyone can find 1 hour. It may require adjustments, trade-offs, or saying no to certain habits, but it's within reach. And that accessibility is what makes it powerful. It levels the playing field. Over time, this daily hour begins to reshape identity. You're no longer someone who wants to improve or plans to start someday. You become someone who shows up consistently. That shift is subtle but important. Identity drives behavior more reliably than motivation ever will. When you see yourself as a person who practices, learns, or builds every day, the habit becomes part of who you are, not just something you try to do. Of course, the hour itself is not magical. What matters is how it's used. Passive effort won't lead to meaningful change. The focus has to be active, intentional, and slightly uncomfortable. Growth tends to live just outside the edge of what feels easy. That means using the hour to stretch your abilities, to engage deeply, and to resist the temptation of shortcuts. There will be days when it feels pointless. Days when progress seems stalled, when the hour feels longer than usual, when distractions pull harder than your intention. These moments are part of the process. The real test is not how productive you feel, but whether you return the next day. Consistency during low motivation periods is what separates lasting change from temporary bursts of enthusiasm. And gradually, something interesting begins to happen. The hour stops feeling like a task and starts feeling like a space where you're in control, where you're building something meaningful, where time feels purposeful rather than wasted. It becomes a part of your day you look forward to, not because it's always easy, but because it's yours. As this practice deepens, questions naturally begin to arise. What should that hour actually be spent on? How do you choose the right? Once the idea of dedicating a single focused hour each day begins to settle in, a more important question quietly emerges. What exactly should that hour be used for? It sounds simple on the surface, but this choice determines everything. Not all effort carries the same weight, and not all activities create meaningful progress. The real value of that hour depends less on how hard you work and more on what you choose to work on. There's a natural tendency to fill that time with whatever feels productive in the moment. Answering emails, organizing files, catching up on small tasks, these give a quick sense of accomplishment, but they rarely move your life in a meaningful direction. The hour is too valuable to be spent on maintenance. It's meant for creation, growth, and forward movement. It's the space where you invest in something that compounds over time. To make that hour count, you need clarity about your direction. Not a perfect, life-defining plan, but a clear enough sense of what matters to you right now. It could be building a skill, improving your health, learning something deeply, or working toward a long-term goal. The key is to choose something that has depth, something that rewards consistency and gets better with time. When you choose wisely, the hour begins to feel different. It carries a quiet importance. You're not just filling time, you're building something. And that shift changes how you approach the work. You become more present, more deliberate. You start to notice small improvements that would otherwise go unseen. A concept that once felt confusing becomes clearer. A task that once felt difficult becomes manageable. These small wins begin to accumulate. There's also an important balance to strike between structure and flexibility. Too much rigidity can make the hour feel like an obligation, something heavy that you eventually resist. Too much looseness, and it loses its purpose. The most effective approach sits somewhere in between. You have a clear intention for the hour, but you allow yourself to adjust based on what the work demands that day. Some days will be focused on learning, absorbing new ideas, understanding concepts, building a foundation. Other days will lean toward execution, applying what you've learned, creating something tangible, testing your abilities. Both are necessary. Learning without action leads to stagnation, while action without understanding leads to shallow progress. The hour becomes a rhythm between these two states. Another subtle but powerful shift happens when you start protecting this time. In the beginning, it's easy for the hour to get pushed aside. Something urgent comes up, or you convince yourself you'll do it later. But later often turns into not today. Treating this hour as non-negotiable changes your relationship with it. It becomes a priority, not an option. This doesn't mean being rigid or unrealistic. Life will interrupt. There will be days when the full hour isn't possible. But even then, the mindset matters. Instead of skipping entirely, you adapt. Maybe it becomes 30 minutes, or even 15. The consistency remains intact. You're reinforcing the identity of someone who shows up, even when conditions aren't perfect. Over time, distractions become easier to recognize. You start noticing how often your attention drifts, how quickly you reach for something easier when the work becomes challenging. The hour acts like a mirror, reflecting your habits back to you. And with that awareness comes the ability to change them. Focus, in this context, becomes a skill in itself. At first, maintaining deep attention for an entire hour can feel difficult. The mind resists. It looks for escape. But with practice, that resistance weakens. You begin to settle into the work more quickly. The noise fades faster. What once felt like effort starts to feel natural. There's also a deeper emotional shift that unfolds quietly. When you dedicate time each day to something meaningful, you begin to trust yourself more. You see evidence of your own commitment. You stop relying on bursts of motivation or external pressure. Instead, you build a steady, internal discipline. And that discipline becomes a source of confidence. Interestingly, the results of this practice often show up in unexpected ways. The skill you're building improves, of course, but so does your ability to think clearly, to manage your time, to handle challenges. The hour begins to influence the rest of your day. You become more intentional, more aware of how you spend your time outside of it. And yet, even with all these benefits, there's a point where many people begin to struggle, not because the idea stops working, but because progress slows down. The early excitement. Truth is, 1 hour a day is enough, but only if you understand how to keep going when it no longer feels exciting, when results take longer to appear, and when the process becomes quietly demanding in ways you didn't expect. There comes a point where the simplicity of the idea begins to feel deceptive. In the beginning, committing to 1 hour a day feels fresh, almost energizing. You show up with intention, you see small improvements, and there's a sense that you're finally moving in the right direction. But as time passes, something shifts. The progress that once felt visible starts to slow down, and the excitement that carried you forward begins to fade into something quieter, less reassuring. This is where most people quietly drift away, not because the method stopped working, but because their expectations were tied too closely to immediate results. When improvement becomes less obvious, it's easy to assume that effort is no longer paying off. But what's actually happening is more subtle. The early phase was about learning and adjustment, where gains come quickly. Now, you've entered a deeper phase, where growth is still happening, but at a level that requires patience to recognize. At this stage, the hour can begin to feel heavier. It's no longer powered by novelty. It requires something more stable, something less emotional and more deliberate. This is where discipline replaces motivation. Not in a harsh or rigid way, but as a quiet decision you make each day, to continue, regardless of how you feel about it in the moment. What makes this phase challenging is that the mind naturally looks for signals of progress. It wants proof that the effort is worth it. When those signals become less frequent, doubt starts to creep in. You might begin to question whether you chose the right focus, whether the hour is being used effectively, or whether you're simply wasting time. These thoughts are normal, but they can become dangerous if they lead to inconsistency. The key here is to shift how you measure progress. Instead of looking for big, noticeable changes, you start paying attention to smaller, more subtle improvements. A task that once took you an hour now takes 40 minutes. A concept that once confused you now feels familiar. You recover from distractions more quickly. These are quiet signs of growth, easy to overlook if you're only searching for dramatic results. There's also a deeper layer to this process that often goes unnoticed. As you continue showing up each day, you're not just improving a skill, you're reshaping your relationship with effort itself. You begin to understand that meaningful work is not always exciting. In fact, much of it is repetitive, sometimes even uncomfortable. But within that repetition lies refinement. Within that discomfort lies progress. Another important realization emerges during this phase. Consistency is not about perfection. There will be days when your focus isn't sharp, when your energy is low, when the hour doesn't feel productive at all. It's easy to label these days as failures, but they're actually part of the process. What matters is that you showed up. Even imperfect effort reinforces the habit. It keeps the rhythm intact. In fact, some of the most important changes happen on these less productive days. They teach you resilience. They remove the dependency on ideal conditions. You begin to understand that progress doesn't require you to feel ready or motivated, it only requires you to begin. At the same time, it becomes important to avoid falling into mindless repetition. Showing up every day is valuable, but only if there's some level of awareness behind the effort. Occasionally, you need to pause and reflect. Not in a way that disrupts the habit, but in a way that refines it. Are you still challenging yourself? Are you pushing slightly beyond what feels comfortable? Or have you settled into a routine that feels easy but no longer leads to growth? This balance between consistency and intentional improvement is what keeps the hour effective over the long term. Without consistency, nothing compounds. Without intention, nothing evolves. As you stay with the process, something interesting begins to happen. The hour starts to feel less like a commitment you have to honor and more like a natural part of your day. It becomes integrated into your identity. You no longer debate whether you'll do it, you simply do. And that shift removes a significant amount of mental friction. There's also a growing sense of independence that comes with this practice. You're no longer relying on external validation or quick results to stay engaged. The act of showing up becomes enough. The process itself starts to feel meaningful, regardless of immediate outcomes. Once felt difficult now feels manageable. What once felt intimidating now feels familiar. This is the compounding effect in action. Not loud, not immediate, but deeply transformative over time. Still, there's another layer to this journey that often goes unspoken. As the hour becomes stable and consistent, a new challenge begins to emerge, not about starting or continuing, but about expanding. About understanding what happens when 1 hour is no longer just a habit, but a foundation for something much larger. At some point, the hour you once had to protect so carefully begins to feel different. It's no longer fragile or easily disrupted. It has become stable, almost automatic, like a quiet anchor in your day. And once that stability is in place, a new question naturally starts to surface: what now? Not in a restless or impatient way, but in a thoughtful, curious sense of possibility. Because when something becomes consistent, it creates space. Mental space, emotional space, even practical space in how you structure your life. You're no longer spending energy trying to start, you're already in motion. And that changes what becomes possible. One of the first things you may notice is that the impact of that single hour is no longer confined to just that hour. It begins to influence how you approach the rest of your day. You make decisions more carefully. You become more aware of how you spend your time. Activities that once felt harmless but unproductive begin to stand out more clearly. Not because you're forcing yourself to change everything, but because your standards have quietly shifted. This is where the idea begins to expand, not by increasing effort, but by deepening awareness. You start to see that the same principles guiding that one focused hour can be applied in smaller ways throughout the day. A few minutes of intentional focus here, a conscious choice there. It's not about turning your entire day into work, but about reducing the amount of time that slips away unconsciously. At the same time, there's a temptation that can arise at this stage. Once you start seeing results, it's natural to want more, faster. You might feel the urge to extend the hour into 2, or to take on multiple goals at once. On the surface, this seems like ambition, but it can quickly become a trap. The strength of the approach lies in its simplicity and sustainability. Expanding too quickly can dilute your focus and reintroduce the overwhelm you initially avoided. Instead, growth at this stage is less about doing more and more about doing better, refining how you use that hour, becoming more precise in your efforts, removing small inefficiencies, paying closer attention to what actually creates progress and what merely feels like progress. This kind of refinement often leads to greater results without requiring more time. There's also a deeper shift happening beneath the surface. You begin to trust the process in a way that you couldn't at the beginning. Early on, you needed visible proof to stay committed. Now, you've experienced enough to understand that results follow consistency, even if they take time. That trust changes your relationship with uncertainty. You become more patient, less reactive. And with that patience comes a certain kind of freedom. You're no longer chasing quick outcomes or constantly second-guessing your direction. You're building something steadily, with a longer perspective in mind. This doesn't mean you stop caring about results, it means you're no longer controlled by the need for immediate ones. Another interesting change is how you begin to view effort itself. What once felt like discipline now feels closer to choice. You're not forcing yourself to show up, you're choosing to. And that subtle difference makes the process feel lighter, even when the work itself is challenging. As this mindset deepens, you may start to notice opportunities you would have overlooked before. Because you're more focused, more consistent, and more intentional, you're better prepared to recognize and act on them. The hour has sharpened your awareness, and that awareness begins to shape your decisions in ways that extend far beyond the original habit. At the same time, it becomes important to stay grounded. Progress can create a sense of momentum, and momentum can sometimes lead to overconfidence. You might start to believe that because the system works, it will continue to work no matter how you approach it. But the truth is, the effectiveness of the hour depends on continued attention and care. The moment it becomes automatic in the wrong way, mindless, unfocused, it starts to lose its power. So there's a quiet balance to maintain. Staying consistent without becoming complacent. Structure designed to prove something deeper, that meaningful change doesn't require dramatic action, but deliberate, repeated attention. Once you understand that, the idea begins to extend beyond time itself. It becomes a way of thinking, a way of approaching growth, a way of navigating your days with more intention. And yet, even with all this progress, there's still one final layer to uncover. Because the real power of this approach isn't just in what it helps you achieve, but in what it helps you let go of, and how that changes the way you see both time and success altogether. After a while, something unexpected begins to happen. The focus slowly shifts away from what you're gaining and toward what you're no longer chasing. In the beginning, the hour was tied to improvement, becoming better, learning faster, achieving more. But over time, as the habit settles into your life, a quieter transformation takes place. You start to let go of the constant pressure to do everything, to keep up with everything, to be everywhere at once. There's a kind of clarity that emerges when you consistently dedicate time to what truly matters. It makes everything else easier to evaluate. You begin to notice how much of your previous effort was scattered across things that didn't really contribute to your growth. Not necessarily harmful, just unnecessary. And without forcing it, you start to step away from those distractions. This isn't about becoming extreme or overly disciplined in every area of life. It's more subtle than that. It's about becoming selective. When you know that 1 hour each day is already being used with intention, you feel less urgency to fill the rest of your time with noise. You become more comfortable with space, with slower moments, with doing fewer things but doing them more consciously. And in that space, your thinking begins to change. You stop viewing time as something to constantly optimize and start seeing it as something to direct. There's a difference. Optimization often leads to pressure, the feeling that every moment needs to be productive. Direction, on the other hand, is about alignment. It's about making sure your time reflects what actually matters to you. This shift removes a quiet kind of anxiety that many people carry without realizing it. The anxiety of feeling behind, of not doing enough, of always needing to catch up. When you've proven to yourself that 1 hour of focused effort, repeated daily, is enough to create real progress, that anxiety starts to lose its grip. You no longer feel the need to rush through everything. There's also a deeper sense of ownership that develops. You're no longer reacting to your day as it unfolds. You've already claimed a part of it. No matter what happens, no matter how unpredictable things become, that hour remains yours. And that creates a kind of stability that's hard to disrupt. Interestingly, this stability doesn't make you rigid, it makes you more adaptable. Because you're grounded in a consistent practice, you're better able to handle change, interruptions, and uncertainty. You don't feel thrown off as easily, because your progress isn't dependent on perfect conditions anymore. At the same time, your definition of success begins to evolve. Early on, success might have been tied to visible results, finishing something, achieving a goal, reaching a milestone. But now, it becomes more connected to the process itself. Showing up, staying engaged, continuing to improve, even in small ways. These become meaningful in their own right. This doesn't mean you stop aiming for larger outcomes. It means those outcomes are no longer the only source of satisfaction. The journey itself becomes steady enough to stand on. And perhaps the most important realization of all is this: the power of 1 hour a day was never just about productivity or achievement. It was about proving that meaningful change is accessible, that it doesn't require a complete life overhaul, or perfect discipline, or endless time. It requires consistency, clarity, and a willingness to continue even when progress feels slow. Once you understand that, the idea expands beyond any single goal or skill. It becomes something you can return to again and again, in different areas of your life. Whenever you feel stuck, overwhelmed, or uncertain, you don't need to solve everything at once. You just need to begin again, with one focused hour. And that's what makes this approach sustainable. It doesn't rely on intensity or short bursts of motivation. It's built on something quieter, but far more reliable: a steady commitment to showing up. In the end, what you gain isn't just progress in a specific area. It's a different relationship with time, with effort. It changes how you approach everything that comes next. Over time, what once felt like a simple practice begins to reveal something much deeper. The hour you set aside each day is no longer just a tool for progress. It becomes a lens through which you start to understand your life more clearly. You begin to notice patterns that were always there but rarely acknowledged. How easily time gets fragmented. How often attention is pulled in different directions. How quickly intention can dissolve without structure. And with that awareness comes a quiet sense of control, not the kind that tries to dominate every outcome, but the kind that allows you to respond rather than react. You are no longer at the mercy of distractions or shifting moods. You've experienced what it means to direct your focus, even if only for an hour, and that experience begins to influence everything else. There's also a growing appreciation for depth. In a world that constantly pushes for speed and immediacy, spending 1 hour a day on something meaningful teaches you the value of staying with something long enough for it to unfold. You begin to see how most things worth having, skill, understanding, confidence, don't respond well to urgency. They require time, attention, and a certain level of patience that can't be rushed. This patience starts to reshape your expectations. You stop looking for shortcuts, not because they don't exist, but because you understand their limitations. Quick wins might give temporary satisfaction, but they rarely lead to lasting change. The hour, repeated over days and months, offers something more stable. It builds a foundation that doesn't disappear when motivation fades. Another shift happens in how you handle setbacks. Earlier, a missed day or an unproductive session might have felt like failure. Now, it feels different. You understand that consistency isn't about never breaking the pattern, it's about returning to it quickly. The gap between falling off and getting back on becomes shorter, and that ability to recover becomes just as important as the habit itself. You also begin to trust your pace. There's less comparison, less urgency to measure yourself against others. When you are engaged in a steady, personal process, external timelines lose some of their influence. You are less concerned with how quickly things are happening and more focused on whether they are moving in the right direction. This doesn't isolate you from ambition, it refines it. Your goals become more grounded, more aligned with what you actually value rather than what feels impressive or urgent from the outside. DIA helps filter out noise, making it easier to recognize what's worth your energy. And perhaps one of the most understated changes is how your relationship with effort softens. Effort is no longer something you resist or avoid. It becomes familiar. Not always easy, not always enjoyable, but no longer intimidating. You've spent enough time engaging with it to know that it won't overwhelm you. It's simply part of the process. There's also a sense of quiet confidence that begins to settle in. Not loud or outwardly visible, but steady. You know that you can commit to something and follow through. You know that even if progress is slow, it's happening. That certainty removes a lot of the internal friction that holds people back. As this confidence grows, you may find yourself approaching other areas of life differently. Challenges that once felt too large start to feel more manageable, not because they've changed, but because you have. You've built a pattern of showing up, and that pattern can be applied anywhere. At the same time, there's a deeper understanding that emerges about balance. The hour is important, but it's not everything. It doesn't need to consume your identity or define your entire day. In fact, its strength comes from its boundaries. Because it's contained, it remains sustainable. Because it's focused, it remains effective. This realization prevents the practice from becoming overwhelming or obsessive. It stays grounded, practical, and adaptable. Something you can carry with you through different phases of life without needing to constantly adjust or reinvent it. And in the end, what remains is a simple but powerful truth. You don't need more time than you think. You need clearer intention with the time you already have. 1 hour, used well, is enough to begin, enough to continue, enough to change direction, to build something meaningful, to move forward without rushing. That idea, once fully understood, doesn't just stay as a habit. It becomes a principle you can rely on. A quiet reminder that progress is not about. At a certain point, the practice becomes so natural that you almost forget how difficult it once felt to begin. The resistance that used to show up at the start of each session has softened, and in its place is something steadier, almost like a quiet agreement you've made with yourself. You no longer negotiate with the hour. You step into it. And yet, this is also where a more subtle challenge appears. Not one that disrupts the habit, but one that tests its depth. When something becomes familiar, there's always a risk of it becoming automatic in the wrong way. The motions stay the same, but the attention behind them fades. You show up, but not fully. You go through the process, but without the same level of intention that once made it powerful. This is the stage where awareness matters more than discipline. Because discipline got you here, but awareness is what keeps the practice alive. You begin to notice the difference between simply completing the hour and actually engaging with it. On the surface, both look the same. The time is spent, the routine is followed. But underneath, the quality is entirely different. One leads to quiet growth. The other leads to stagnation disguised as consistency. So the focus shifts again, not toward doing more, but toward staying present within what you're already doing. It's a small adjustment, but it changes everything. You start paying closer attention to how you think during that hour, where your focus drifts, where you avoid difficulty, where you settle for what feels comfortable instead of what leads to progress. This kind of attention brings a certain honesty into the process. You can no longer hide behind the idea that time alone is enough. You begin to see that how you use the time matters just as much as the fact that you're using it. And with that honesty comes the opportunity to refine further. You start making small, deliberate adjustments. You challenge yourself a little more. You stay with difficult problems a little longer instead of moving on too quickly. You question your own assumptions. You engage more deeply. These changes are subtle, almost invisible from the outside, but they mark the difference between maintaining progress and accelerating it. At the same time, there's a growing sense of calm that develops around the entire process. You're no longer searching for the perfect method or constantly wondering if you're doing enough. You've seen the results of steady effort. You trust it now. That trust removes a lot of unnecessary noise. You also become more comfortable with the idea that not every hour will feel significant. Some sessions will stand out, where everything clicks and progress feels obvious. Others will feel slow, even frustrating. But you no longer judge the process based on individual days. You've learned to zoom out, to see the pattern rather than the moment. This perspective changes how you handle those slower days. Instead of resisting them, you accept them as part of the rhythm. You still show up, still engage, but without the added weight of expectation. And interestingly, this acceptance often makes it easier to move through those periods without losing momentum. There's also a deeper sense of alignment that begins to form. Because you've spent so much time consistently engaging with something meaningful, you start to feel more connected to what you're doing. It's no longer just a goal or a task, it becomes part of how you experience your day. This alignment has a quiet but powerful effect. It reduces internal conflict. You're not constantly torn between what you should do and what you want to do. The gap between those two begins to close. And from that place, decisions become simpler. Not always easier, but clearer. You know what matters. You know where your time is best spent. And that clarity extends beyond the hour into the rest of your life. But even here, at this more stable and refined stage, there's still one final shift that completes the picture. Because eventually, the question is no longer about how to use the hour. In the end, what changes most is not your schedule, your productivity, or even your results, it's your sense of self. The hour you committed to each day may have started as a simple experiment, a small attempt to bring structure into your life. But over time, it becomes something far more personal. It becomes evidence. Evidence that you can choose something and stay with it. Evidence that progress doesn't require perfect conditions. Evidence that you are capable of shaping your time instead of being shaped by it. And this evidence quietly rewrites the way you see yourself. Before, there may have been hesitation. Plans that stayed in your head. Ideas that felt distant, uncertain, or too demanding to begin. A lingering sense that meaningful change required something more time, more clarity, more motivation. But now, you've experienced a different reality. You've seen what happens when you stop waiting and start showing up, even in small, consistent ways. That experience creates a kind of internal shift that's hard to reverse. You no longer fully believe the old excuses, even when they appear. You recognize them for what they are, temporary resistance, not permanent limitations. There's also a stronger sense of ownership over your direction. You're less likely to drift, less likely to hand over your time to whatever feels urgent in the moment. Not because you've become rigid or overly controlled, but because you've learned the value of intention. You know what it feels like to use your time well, and that awareness stays with you. This doesn't mean life suddenly becomes perfectly organized or predictable. There will still be distractions, interruptions, unexpected demands. But they no longer define your days in the same way. They exist around your intention, not in place of it. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to trust yourself in a deeper way. Not just to start things, but to continue them. To stay with something long enough for it to matter. That trust is quiet, but it changes how you approach everything. Goals that once felt intimidating start to feel approachable, not because they've become easier, but because you've built a reliable way to move toward them. You don't need to figure everything out in advance. You just need to begin, and then return the next day. There's also a sense of patience that settles in, but it's not passive. It's active, steady. You're willing to give things time, not because you're waiting, but because you're working. Each day adds something, even if it's not immediately visible. And over time, that accumulation becomes undeniable. At this point, the idea of 1 hour a day is no longer something you question. It's something you understand. Not as a rule, but as a principle. A way of approaching growth that feels grounded and realistic. You realize that most people don't fail because they lack ability or opportunity. They struggle because they underestimate what small, consistent effort can do over time. They look for dramatic change and overlook the quiet kind, the kind that builds slowly, but lasts. And you've stepped into that quieter path. There's no need to rush, no need to prove anything quickly. You've seen enough to know that progress is happening, even when it's not obvious. That understanding creates a kind of calm confidence, one that doesn't depend on external validation or immediate results. From here, the path forward becomes simpler. Not easier, but clearer. Whatever you choose to pursue, you already know the approach. You don't need a completely new system or a surge of motivation. You return to what works. You give it time. You stay consistent. And that's where the real power lies, not in the hour itself, but in what it represents. A decision, repeated daily. A commitment, quietly honored. A way of moving, and even after everything settles into place, there's still one final layer that only becomes visible with time. It's not about doing more, improving faster, or reaching higher. It's about understanding what all of this was really building toward in the first place. Because when you look back, the hour was never just about productivity. It wasn't simply a tool to learn a skill or complete a goal. It was a way to reclaim attention in a world that constantly tries to divide it. And that realization changes how you see not just your time, but your life. Attention is one of the few things that truly belongs to you. And yet, for most people, it's scattered throughout the day, pulled by notifications, demands, habits, and endless streams of information. The hour you chose to protect became a small act of resistance against that pattern. A space where your attention was no longer fragmented, but directed. At first, it was just an hour. But over time, it taught you something much bigger, that where your attention goes, your life follows. This awareness begins to extend beyond your daily practice. You start noticing how often you're present versus distracted, how often you're choosing versus reacting. And without forcing it, you begin to make small adjustments. You bring a little more intention into conversations, into decisions, into how you spend even the between moments of your day. It's not about being perfectly focused all the time. That's neither realistic nor necessary. It's about having the ability to return, to catch yourself when your attention drifts and gently bring it back. The same way you've done, again and again, during that 1 hour. And this ability has a quiet but profound impact. It makes your experiences feel richer, your thinking clearer, your actions more aligned. You're no longer just moving through your days, you're actually inside them. There's also a shift in how you measure value. Before, it might have been tied to output, how much you completed, how quickly you moved, how visibly you progressed. Now, there's a deeper layer. You begin to value depth over speed, presence over constant activity. This doesn't make you less effective. If anything, it makes you more precise. Because when your attention is fully engaged, even a small amount of time can produce meaningful results. You've seen that firsthand. And perhaps that's the most important understanding of all. It was never about having more time. It was about using the time you already had in a different way. 1 hour was simply the starting point, a manageable, realistic entry into a different way of living. But the principle behind it, focused, consistent, intentional effort, doesn't have limits. It can be applied anywhere, at any scale. And yet, the beauty of it is that it doesn't need to expand to be effective. Even if it always remains just 1 hour a day, it's enough. Enough to learn, to build, to change direction, to create something meaningful over time. There's a certain simplicity in that realization. You don't need to complicate things. You don't need to chase every opportunity or optimize every moment. You just need to return, again and again, to what matters. And in a world that often encourages more speed, more output, more noise, that simplicity becomes a kind of strength. So in the end, what stays with you isn't just the habit or the results it produced. It's the understanding that meaningful change is not dramatic. It's quiet. It's steady. It's built in small, deliberate moments that most people overlook. Moments like a single hour, chosen with intention, and after everything has been understood, practiced, and experienced, what remains is something surprisingly simple. Not a system, not a rule, not even a habit in the traditional sense, but a way of relating to your life that feels calmer, clearer, and far more deliberate. Because in the end, the idea was never trying to make you busier. It was trying to show you that most of what feels overwhelming isn't actually about the amount of work you have, but about how scattered your attention becomes while trying to do it all. When everything feels important, nothing truly gets the depth it needs. And that's where frustration begins. They changed that. Not by removing responsibilities or simplifying your life overnight, but by introducing a single point of focus. A place where things slow down just enough for you to engage properly. And once you experienced that kind of clarity, it became harder to go back to constant distraction without noticing the difference. You begin to see how much energy is lost in switching between tasks, in half-finished thoughts, in divided attention. And more importantly, you realize that reducing that friction doesn't require a complete life overhaul. It starts with choosing one thing, giving it your full attention, and allowing that to be enough for now. There's a certain relief in that. The pressure to do everything at once starts to fade. You are no longer carrying the weight of every goal, every idea, every expectation all at the same time. Instead, you are working through them, one focused session at a time. This doesn't make your ambitions smaller. It makes them more realistic, more grounded. You are still capable of pursuing big things, but now you have a way to approach them that doesn't rely on urgency or exhaustion. And perhaps one of the most lasting changes is how you begin to trust time itself. Before, time might have felt like something you were constantly running out of, something that slipped away too quickly, leaving you with the sense that you hadn't done enough. But now, there's a different perspective. You've seen what consistent, focused effort can do over days, weeks, and months. You understand that time, when used well, doesn't need to be chased. It needs to be engaged with. Even a small amount, used properly, is enough to create movement. This understanding brings a kind of patience that isn't passive. You are still active, still working, still showing up, but without the constant urgency that used to sit in the background. You are no longer trying to force results. You are allowing them to emerge through consistency. There's also a deeper acceptance that not every day needs to feel perfect. Some days will be sharp and productive. Others will feel slower, heavier, less clear. But these variations no longer disrupt your direction. They are just part of the rhythm. You don't stop because a day feels off. You return the next day, and the next, without overthinking it. And in that rhythm, something steady begins to form. Not just progress in what you are working on, but stability in how you approach your life. You become less reactive, less scattered, less pulled in different directions. There's a center now, a point you return to daily. From the outside, it may not look dramatic. There are no sudden transformations or overnight success stories. But internally, the shift is undeniable. You think differently. You choose differently. You use your time with more care. And over time, those internal shifts begin to shape external results in ways that feel natural rather than forced. That's the quiet power of this approach. It doesn't demand intensity. It doesn't depend on motivation. It doesn't require you to become someone completely different. It simply asks you to show up, consistently, with intention, 1 hour at a time. And if you carry that forward, without overcomplicating it, without trying to turn it into something bigger than it needs to be, you'll find that it continues to work, quietly, in the background of your life. Not as a strict rule you have to follow, but as something you can always return to, whenever things feel unclear, or overwhelming, and once all of this settles into your life, there's a quiet realization that feels almost surprising in its simplicity. Nothing about your circumstances may have changed dramatically on the surface. Your days might still look similar. Your responsibilities may still be there. The world around you continues at the same pace. And yet, your experience of it feels entirely different. What changed was never just your schedule, it was your relationship with control. Before, control might have felt like something external, something dependent on having enough time, the right conditions, or the perfect plan. It often felt just out of reach, as if life was always slightly ahead of you. But through this steady practice, you begin to see that control was never about managing everything. It was about directing something small, consistently. That 1 hour became proof that you don't need to take over your entire life to change it. You just need a point of stability, a place where your choices are clear and your attention is fully yours. And once you have that, everything else begins to organize itself around it. There's less urgency to fix everything at once, less pressure to have all the answers immediately. You are no longer trying to control outcomes, you are focusing on actions. And that shift makes life feel lighter, even when it's still demanding. You also become more comfortable with the idea of incompleteness. There will always be more to do, more to learn, more to figure out. But instead of seeing that as a problem, you start to accept it as part of the process. You don't need to finish everything today. You just need to continue. This acceptance removes a surprising amount of mental weight. The constant feeling of being behind begins to fade. Not because you've caught up with everything, but because you've changed how you move through it. There's also a deeper sense of alignment that becomes more noticeable over time. The gap between what you say matters and how you spend your time starts to close. Not perfectly, but consistently. And that alignment creates a kind of internal clarity that's hard to replace with anything else. When your actions reflect your priorities, even in small ways, there's less internal conflict. You don't have to convince yourself that you are on the right path, you can see it in what you do each day, and that brings a quiet kind of confidence. Not loud or performative, but steady. You are no longer relying on bursts of motivation or external validation to feel like you are moving forward. You have your own evidence, built day by day. At the same time, you become more patient with yourself. You understand that growth doesn't follow a straight line. There are periods of clarity and periods of confusion, moments of progress and moments that feel stagnant. But none of these phases define the overall direction unless you let them. You've learned to continue through all of them. And perhaps the most meaningful shift of all is how you begin to approach the future. It no longer feels like something distant that requires a complete transformation to reach. It feels closer, more accessible, not because it's guaranteed, but because you have a way to move toward it. You don't need to wait for the right time. You don't need to feel completely ready. You already know how to begin. That understanding removes a lot of hesitation. Ideas don't sit idle for as long. Decisions don't feel as overwhelming. You've reduced the gap between thinking and doing. And in that space, life becomes more active, more intentional. But what makes this approach truly lasting is that it doesn't demand perfection. It allows for adjustment, for change, for starting over when needed. No matter how many times the rhythm is interrupted, the principle remains the same. You return, not with pressure, not with frustration, but with clarity. In the end, what stays with you is not the structure of the hour, but the quiet understanding that you can always begin again. No matter how far you drift, how busy life becomes, or how many times your routine breaks, there's always a simple way back. Not through big decisions or sudden changes, but through something much smaller and more reliable. You return to a single point of focus, and you start there. This idea becomes especially important during the moments when everything feels off. When your days lose their rhythm, when distractions take over, when motivation disappears. These are the times that used to create the most frustration, the sense that you've lost progress, that you need to restart from the beginning, that everything has been undone. But now, that feeling doesn't hold the same weight. Because you understand something you didn't before, nothing is truly lost. The habit may pause, the momentum may slow, but the ability to return remains. And that ability is what makes the entire process sustainable. You don't need to rebuild everything from scratch. You don't need to wait for the perfect moment to reset. You simply begin again, the same way you did before. 1 hour. That's all it takes to reconnect with the direction you've chosen. And what's interesting is that each time you return, it becomes slightly easier. Not because the work changes, but because your relationship with it has already been shaped. You're not starting from zero, you're continuing from experience. There's less hesitation, less overthinking. You know what it feels like to sit down and focus. You know how to move through resistance. You've done it enough times that it no longer feels unfamiliar. This creates a kind of resilience that goes beyond the habit itself. You become less afraid of falling off track, because you trust your ability to get back on. And that trust changes how you move through life. You're more willing to try things, to explore new directions, to take on challenges that once felt uncertain. Because even if things don't go as planned, you know you have a way to re-center yourself. A way to rebuild momentum without needing to rely on perfect conditions. There's also a deeper sense of calm in knowing that progress doesn't need to be constant to be real. There can be pauses, slow periods, even setbacks, and none of them erase what you've built. They're just part of a longer rhythm. And within that rhythm, the hour becomes less of a strict routine and more of a steady anchor. Something you return to not because you have to, but because it helps you stay aligned. It keeps things clear. It brings you back to what matters. At this point, the idea has fully settled into something natural. It's no longer something you're trying to follow, it's something you understand. A principle that fits into your life without forcing itself onto it. You no longer need reminders or external motivation to maintain it. The value is clear enough on its own. And perhaps the most meaningful part of all this is how it changes your sense of time itself. Time no longer feels like something slipping away or something you're constantly trying to manage. It feels more like something you engage with, intentionally and steadily. You're not rushing through it, and you're not waiting for it either. You're using it, even if only for 1 hour a day. And somehow, that becomes enough. Enough to grow, enough to build, enough to move forward without feeling overwhelmed. That's the quiet truth at the center of everything you've experienced. Not complicated, not dramatic, but deeply reliable. You don't need more time than you have. You just need to use a small part of it with clarity, consistency, and care. And if you can do that, if you can return to it, and when you sit with all of this long enough, a final kind of clarity begins to settle in. One that feels less like a new idea and more like something you somehow always knew, but never fully trusted. You start to see that most of the struggle was never about time itself. It was about how fragmented your attention had become, how often your energy was pulled in directions you didn't consciously choose. The feeling of being overwhelmed wasn't coming from doing too much. It was coming from doing too many things without depth. That's what made everything feel heavier than it actually was. Dia changed that, not by removing responsibilities, but by reintroducing depth into your day. It gave you a direct experience of what it feels like to be fully engaged with something, without rushing, without splitting your focus. And once you've felt that, even briefly, it becomes a reference point. You begin to notice the contrast everywhere. Moments where you are present start to feel different. Tasks that once seemed normal now feel slightly incomplete when your attention is divided. You don't necessarily change everything at once, but your awareness sharpens. And that awareness quietly starts guiding your choices. You begin to prefer depth over distraction. Not in an extreme or rigid way, but naturally. You find yourself choosing fewer things, but engaging with them more fully. Conversations become more attentive. Work becomes more focused. Even rest begins to feel more intentional, because you are actually present for it. And this is where the deeper value of the practice reveals itself. It's not just about what you accomplish during that hour, it's about how it reshapes the quality of the rest of your life. Because when your attention improves, everything improves. Your thinking becomes clearer because it's not constantly interrupted. Your decisions become more grounded because you are actually considering them. Your work becomes more effective because it's done with focus instead of fragmentation. And perhaps most importantly, your experience of time itself becomes richer. Moments don't pass as quickly when you are fully in them. There's more awareness, more detail, more presence. It's a subtle shift, but it changes how life feels. At the same time, there's a deeper sense of acceptance that begins to take hold. You stop expecting yourself to be perfectly consistent, perfectly focused, perfectly productive. You've seen enough to understand that variation is part of the process. Some days will be sharp, others will feel slower. Some hours will feel meaningful, others will feel ordinary. But none of that disrupts the larger pattern unless you let it. You've moved beyond needing every day to feel significant. You understand that significance is built over time, not in isolated moments. And that understanding brings a certain steadiness. You are less reactive to fluctuations, less likely to overthink temporary setbacks. You stay with the process, even when it feels uneventful, because you know that's where the real work happens. And in that steadiness, something else becomes clear. You don't need to constantly search for better systems, better methods, better strategies. Those things can help, but they are not the foundation. The foundation is much simpler: showing up, focusing, continuing. You've experienced firsthand that this is enough. Not in a theoretical sense, but in a practical, repeatable way. And once you trust that, you stop complicating things. You don't feel the need to constantly optimize every part of your life. You don't chase every new idea or approach. You return to what works, quietly and consistently. There's a kind of confidence in that simplicity. It removes a lot of unnecessary noise. And from that place, growth becomes less about pushing harder and more about staying aligned. Staying connected to what matters. Staying engaged with what you've chosen to build. DR remains at the center of it all, not as a rule you must follow, but as a reminder. A simple, reliable way to return to clarity whenever things feel scattered. And that's what makes it lasting. It doesn't depend on your mood, your circumstances, or your environment. And after everything has been lived through, not just understood, not just practiced, but quietly integrated into your days, there's a final shift that feels almost invisible, yet changes everything. You stop thinking in terms of effort, not because you've stopped working, or growing, or showing up, but because the internal resistance that once made everything feel heavy has slowly dissolved. What used to feel like something you had to push yourself into now feels like a natural extension of who you are. The hour is still there. The focus is still there. The consistency remains. But it no longer feels like discipline. It feels like alignment. You're no longer forcing yourself to do what you know is good for you. You're simply choosing it, the same way you would choose anything that clearly makes your life better. There's less negotiation, less internal back and forth. The decision has already been made, quietly, over time. And that changes the texture of everything. Work feels different when it's not resisted. Time feels different when it's not constantly slipping away. Even effort feels different when it's not something you're trying to avoid. There's a calmness in that. A steadiness that doesn't rely on motivation or external structure. You've built something internal, something that doesn't need to be constantly managed or restarted. And from that place, your relationship with growth becomes much more natural. You're no longer chasing improvement in a restless way. You're participating in it, allowing it to unfold through your actions, rather than trying to force it through pressure. There's also a deeper sense of sufficiency that begins to take hold. Not complacency, not a lack of ambition, but a quiet understanding that what you're doing is enough. That you don't need to constantly add more, do more, or prove more for your efforts to matter. 1 hour, used well, continues to be enough. Enough to maintain progress. Enough to deepen your understanding. Enough to keep moving forward without losing balance. And that sense of enoughness is what makes everything sustainable. Because the moment something feels like it's never enough, it becomes exhausting. It turns into a constant chase, where no amount of effort feels satisfying. But when you recognize that steady, focused action is already meaningful, the pressure begins to ease. You're still growing, but without the constant tension. There's also a noticeable shift in how you experience your days as a whole. They feel less fragmented, less rushed. Not because you have more time, but because you're more present within the time you have. You're not constantly thinking about what's next while doing something else. You're more often where you are. And that presence, simple as it sounds, changes the quality of everything. Conversations feel more real. Work feels more engaging. Even ordinary moments carry a bit more clarity. It's not dramatic, but it's consistent. And that consistency is what makes it lasting. At this stage, the original idea has fully matured. It's no longer something you're trying to apply, it's something you've absorbed. A way of approaching time, effort, and attention that feels natural, almost obvious in hindsight. You don't need reminders anymore. You don't need to convince yourself. The value has been proven, quietly, through experience. And so you continue, not out of obligation, not out of pressure, but because it simply makes sense. 1 hour, one focus, one deliberate return to what matters. And from there, everything. And when everything finally settles into place, there's nothing left to add, fix, or optimize. Not because you've reached some perfect state, but because you've arrived at something far more stable. A way of living that doesn't depend on constant adjustment. What began as a simple idea has now become something quieter and more permanent. It's no longer something you think about often. It's simply how you move through your days. You no longer ask whether 1 hour is enough. You've seen that it is. Not because it solves everything instantly, but because it keeps everything moving. It creates a steady rhythm that carries you forward, even when life becomes unpredictable. And that rhythm is what you rely on now, not bursts of energy or moments of clarity. There's also a sense of ease that replaces what used to feel like pressure. You are not trying to control every outcome or accelerate every result. You've stepped out of that urgency. You understand that forcing things rarely leads to anything lasting. Instead, you've learned to trust a slower, more deliberate pace. This doesn't make you passive. You are still engaged, still building, still moving forward. But there's no strain behind it. No constant feeling that you are falling behind or need to catch up. You are simply continuing. And that continuity is what gives your progress its strength. Because anything built this way, steadily, patiently, with attention, tends to last. It doesn't collapse under pressure. It doesn't disappear when motivation fades. It holds, because it was never dependent on unstable conditions to begin with. There's also a deeper kind of independence that emerges here. You are no longer looking outside for the perfect method, the perfect timing, or the perfect system. You've already experienced what works. You don't need complexity. You don't need constant change. You don't need to keep searching. You return to the same principle, again and again, because it continues to hold up. And that simplicity becomes a kind of advantage. While others are constantly adjusting, restarting, or overcomplicating their approach, you remain steady, not because you figured everything out, but because you found something reliable enough to stick with. There's a quiet confidence in that. Not something you need to express or prove, but something you carry with you. You know that if there's something you want to build, learn, or improve, you already have a way to begin. You don't hesitate as much. You don't overthink as long. You start, and then you continue. And over time, that way of operating begins to shape your life in ways that feel natural rather than forced. Opportunities are approached with more clarity. Challenges are handled with more patience. Decisions are made with more intention. Not perfectly, but consistently. And that consistency is what makes everything feel grounded. In the end, there's no dramatic conclusion to all of this. No final breakthrough moment where everything suddenly changes. Because the real change has already happened, slowly, across all the days you chose to show up. It happened in the moments that felt ordinary, in the hours that didn't feel special, in the days where nothing obvious seemed to improve. That's where the shift took place. And now, looking forward, there's nothing complicated about what comes next. You continue, not because you have to, but because it's become part of how you live. 1 hour when you can, focused when possible, present more often than before. And when things drift, as they sometimes will, you don't see it as failure. You simply return, again and again, without frustration, without pressure, because you understand something now that can't be easily undone. Small, consistent effort, guided by attention and repeated over time, is enough. Not just in theory, but in practice. Not just once, but always. And that understanding stays with you, quietly shaping everything that comes next.